As we are in our series, Leaving Egypt, and we're looking at this ancient, enslaved, oppressed people and their journey to freedom. And we said that this really old story of people far away at a totally different time actually connects to us in some deeply spiritual and practical ways because slavery is a reality people live with every day. Now, we could talk about the very literal slavery that there are people all around the world still exist in, but we're talking more about this spiritual slavery, this personal slavery that we at times find ourselves in, right? When it comes to like addiction or maybe the trauma of an abuse you feel enslaved or oppressed by, or maybe it's a certain person or violence and systems of oppression. There's fear, right, that enslaves us and runs our lives and makes these decisions for us, and it traps us. And then we're also talking about this deeper spiritual slavery, right, from which we all need freedom. And if we can realize that freedom, we begin to live a full, healthy, everyday life. And so that's kind of what we're talking about as we talk about this slavery and this reality. So now, for today's talk, we need to go back and remind ourselves of something we talked about in week 1, and we looked at this promise of God to this oppressed people. In Exodus 6, we find this. God is talking to Moses, and he gives this promise. He says, therefore, say to the people, right? This is what I want you to tell the people from me. He says, I am the Lord. I will free you from your oppression and will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. So it's these what we call the 4 steps of liberation, and during the Passover celebration, we find that these 4 steps are followed through 4 questions as you go through the Hebrew people go throughout their Passover celebrations. They ask questions surrounding these 4 aspects of their liberation. Even today, people observe that regularly. It says, then you will know that I am the Lord your God who has freed you from your oppression in Egypt. I will bring you into the land I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So there's this promise of what God was going to do now based on this promise that God gave their forefathers before this to take them to a specific place, often referred to as the promised land. But they were in this place that was the exact opposite that they needed to be liberated from. So this is God's process and promise of liberation. And in week 1, our idea worth discussing was that there's a way out. And that Passover points us to the person and the work of Jesus. That what God did through Moses for the people of Israel at Passover, God was doing for the world through Jesus at the cross. And so we connected those 2 things to say this, that for our spiritual slavery, there's a way out. There's a way out, and that is good news. And then we looked the next week at this first step of liberation to be taken out. And we asked the question, where are you locked in slavery? And are you willing to hear God's voice of liberation? Because freedom begins by answering the call of the liberated, of the liberator to be liberated. And liberation wasn't just about getting the people of Egypt out of Egypt. It was about getting Egypt out of them. And there's this process that would follow after that, which takes us to this next step of being delivered, where God said he was going to free them. So this where are you in a wilderness or desert unto death, and what about you needs to die? Because one way of being in the world needs to die before something else more meaningful, more healthy, more true can be resurrected. And so we said imagination fuels emancipation. Our ability to imagine a new life, a new way of being in the world, fuels the process that makes that a reality, of getting the things that have enslaved us out of us. I believe that through Jesus, we have been liberated. We have been called out. But now we have to get those things out of us, right? Because they still surround us, and they still at times enslave us in our own, within our own choices. And so this week we're going to look at step 3 of liberation, and that is being redeemed. He said that he would redeem them, which is this process of bringing them to him. And so we saw the story of Mount Sinai and this significance of the mountain because it represented this place where they met God, where they were in God's presence. And today our question is this: where are you hearing God's new promise in your life? Where are you hearing God's new promise? At Mount Sinai, we're going to see that God gives them a new process and a new promise for what he's doing in their life. And so our question is, for you, where are you hearing God's new promise in your life? So let's jump into this chapter, Exodus 19, a little bit. Let's jump into this event, this story, and pull some things out that can help us practically and spiritually live in freedom and ultimately feel and experience God's redemption. So it says this: Then Moses climbed the mountain to appear before God. The Lord called to him from the mountain and said, "Give these instructions to the family of Jacob." So again, Moses, God has instructions. He has a message for the people, and Moses is going to bring this to them. Announce it to the descendants of Israel. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians, right? Remember this thing that happened. It was a big deal. This is a big process. This global superpower at the time, right? Like I delivered you from them. Okay, but there's more. You know how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. That's a key phrase there. Now, if you will obey me and keep my covenant, contract, agreement, you will be my own special treasure from among all the peoples on earth. For all the earth belongs to me, and you will be my kingdom of priests. Now, this idea of kingdom of priests, that what the priests did was stand in the gap between God and the people and provided these ceremonies and these rituals to ultimately bring forgiveness of sins to the people and to connect them in relationship to God. But it was kind of this mediator. And this is very important because the reason they were going to be a kingdom of priests is because this is where this other promise would take place, where God would provide a mediator to stand between them that once and for all would bring the entire world into what God was doing, into God's presence. He calls them my holy nation. This is the message you must give to the people of Israel. And so our idea worth discussing today, what we're going to talk about is this: God's promises always includes God's presence. God's promises always include God's presence. They've been taken out of Egypt, and now they're going to be taken in before they're taken to. And this taken in is the aspect of that they will feel, experience, they will see it, they'll hear it, they'll know God's presence is in the middle of this group of people that is journeying from one place to another, out of slavery to a promised place. Maybe that is you right now, right? The thing that you need most in your journey towards spiritual freedom is the promise that you're not alone. Now, maybe you're sitting in your house alone right now. Maybe during this time, feeling that you're not alone is going to be really hard. But you need that promise that you're not alone, you're not abandoned, but you're loved, you belong, and God is with you. Maybe that's the next step in your spiritual journey. Maybe that's what you need right now, as what's going on in our world is this unavoidable aspect, new aspect to our life. And that's what you need to hear, is that God is with you, God loves you, and you are not alone. So let's talk about promise and presence, the importance of God's promises that include his presence. Let's continue in this story. So he promises them, I'm going to bring you to me. This is what redemption is you and me were apart, and I'm going to bring you into me, and there is presence. And we all understand the importance of presence. Let's continue the story. It says, then the Lord told Moses, go down and prepare the people for my arrival. Remember, they didn't want to go up the mountains. He's going to come down. Consecrate them today and tomorrow. So this consecration is like, it's a big, oftentimes religious or maybe churchy word for have them go through a process that's going to set them apart. It's going to prepare them for what's next. He says, be sure that they are ready on the third day, which is also significant. For on that day, the Lord will come down on Mount Sinai as all the people watch. And the first aspect of promise and presence we're going to talk about is this: prepare yourself for what God is going to do. Prepare yourself for what God is going to do. That's what he's doing with the people. They needed to prepare themselves. They needed to get their mind right. And a lot of time getting our mind prepared for what God is going to do, for the presence of God in our life, or what God is going to do next, is we need to prepare with some tangible steps. They were to wash their clothes. They were to abstain from sexual intercourse for those days. And there were these things that they would do tangibly, practically, to prepare themselves spiritually for the presence of God. And in our own life, we have to be prepared. There are some practical, tangible things that you need to do. And this will look different from person to person. But there's wisdom to be found both in the story of the Bible and the story of those around you, right? Those who maybe are ahead of you in a spiritual journey, or those that you look to and you go, man, they seem to live differently than I do, and they have something that I want. And there's wisdom to be found there. And there's also these universal practical principles that work for all of us. And the question is, are you preparing? And maybe that's what this season of time is in your life, to prepare yourself for what God is going to do. I know I've been feeling this a lot lately as we're kind of holed up in our house, and there's a little bit of a stall in aspects of our lives, and some of the uncertainty and things that we were trying to do even in our own home. I look at it all and I go, okay, well, maybe God is asking me to prepare myself, because something on the back end of this is going to happen that is meaningful, and God is going to do it. And I need to have my heart, my mind prepared, but also there's some very tangible, practical things that I've got to prepare in this time. And that could be what God is doing in your life, that his presence and what he's going to do in your life, he needs you to be prepared for. Let's continue the story. In Exodus 19, it says this: Moses led them out from the camp. So this is the third day. They're all going to come out of their camp. They're going to come out of their tents to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. And this was where God actually had this specific boundary of where they couldn't cross, and certain people could cross these boundaries and come up to the mountain. But basically, they all had to stand in position. They were going to hear from God. They were going to get this covenant, this contract with God. And our lesson here for our life is this: position yourself to hear what God is saying. Prepare yourself for what God's going to do, but position yourself to hear what God is saying. I believe this is true. God is speaking. Are we listening? Like in your spirit, are you positioned to hear from God? In your life, have you drowned out the noise and maybe the distractions enough to hear God? Maybe that's what God is doing in your time of quarantine, is he's trying to position you to hear what he is going to do in your life. And you need to hear from him. Are we listening? In this moment right now, God is calling you to be free. Are you listening? And let's position ourselves to hear what God says, because I believe that none of us are very far from God, and he is speaking. And then lastly, we have this: present yourself to God. We see this final step. They hear from God. There's this covenant agreement that's kind of being exchanged. And then God is going to do something. He's going to give them the 10 Commandments. And this was the people's way of responding to the love and the grace of God and what he was doing in their liberation. And the 10 Commandments were very practical ways to live in their relationship with God. The first 4 commandments are very divine commandments in their relationship with God, and also in their relationship with others. And we look back and we go, well, don't murder, right? That's one of the commands. That's pretty good. Like, don't lie. Yeah, lie. Like, we understand that. But at that time, to have this structured law that would teach them how to be a different kind of people in the world in this ancient story was actually a big deal. This was God moving them forward and preparing them to be this group of people that he needed them to be in the world. This was not to show that God is looking for us to mess up so that he can punish us. Maybe that's how you have viewed things like this in the past. Maybe you know people who this is their view of God and things like commandments, right? Oh, that's just a religious way to say that God wants us, God's going to show us that we're bad and he wants to punish us, and it gives them a reason to do it. It's like, no, that's none of this. This is something altogether different. I think Rob Bell in his book, Jesus Wants to Save Christians, says it well. He says the 10 Commandments are a new way to be human, a new way to live and move in the world, in covenant with God who hears the cry of the oppressed and liberates them. This is a good God, not a bad, mean God. Everything about the rest of the commandments speaks to the newfound liberation. God is inviting, God is looking, God is searching for a body, a group of people to be the body of God in the world, right? There's nothing in the Hebrew scriptures, though, that shows us that the people ever kept God's law. As a matter of fact, we have a lot to prove that they never really kept God's law, that they actually find themselves exiled and under the rule of other people because they did not follow God's law and God's way. And all that did, well, again, while we look at that, we can go, oh, well, then God just punished them. He was just looking for, no. God then rescues them. And what it is this undeniable picture of God's grace. Is God's grace because he continues to love them. He continues to bring them to himself. And he did that with Jesus in a big way, because Jesus, when he was born, one of the things that was said about him is he would be called Emmanuel. He would be called this person that was God with us. His disciples, one of them wrote, John, when he wrote his gospel, he wrote it down. He said, Jesus came down, and when we were with him, it was like we were with God, and he tabernacled with us. He built his tent right next to us. He was God in a body. He was present. And God is always pursuing and always coming after humanity in finding new ways to be present with people, right? Because Jesus was God with us. And then we see that when Jesus dies and he raises again from the dead and he leaves, he says, hey, this new thing is going to happen. The God's Spirit is actually going to be in you. As close as you can possibly imagine, that's God's presence in spirit. When humanity moves away from God, God pursues humanity. And he creates new ways to be close to them. Like Jesus said, I and the Father are one, and if you're in me and I'm in you, we're one, and then we're one with the Father. And this is dynamic, communal energy. There's this thing going on. And maybe you're like, I don't feel present. I don't feel at one with God. Well, you know what? This was a common thing, and this is a common thing. We need to be reminded of it. In the New Testament, one of the writers, Paul, he writes to this church at Colossae, and he would have written this. It would have been passed around about 5 or 6 churches in that region. He writes them this letter. And right away, at the very top, in the first section of the letter, he's going to remind them of who Jesus is and what God did through Jesus to reconcile, to take these to people who are far away and bring them close, to be present with people. And here's what he says, and this is such a reminder for us that this is what God has already done and that we can realize in our life is this. He says, this includes you. The thing that God did through Jesus includes you, who were once far away from God. You were his enemies, separated from him by your evil thoughts and actions. Again, we were enslaved, right? We were in this spiritual Egypt. Yet now he has reconciled. He has, this is another word for redemption. He's brought you back in to himself through the death of Christ in his physical body. As a result, he has brought you into his own, presence. And you are holy and blameless as you stand before him without a single fault. Now, God did for us what we couldn't do for ourselves. And you probably, knowing yourself, if we're honest with ourselves, we don't feel in God's presence, we don't feel holy and blameless and without a single fault. Because we know our faults. We know the things that have brought the fear, guilt, and shame in our life. We understand that thing that we're chained to, that brings the hurt and the brokenness to us, and that causes us to hurt other people. But he says, no, God did something through Jesus, and it's been done, and you can realize it. You can live like it's been done, or you can continue in slavery. But he said what he's done is he stands you right before him blameless. You're in his presence, and he wants you there. And you're there because of what Jesus did. You are reconciled. This is God being present, not just with us, but in us. Why? Well, because God's promises always includes God's presence. This is what God is doing in the world. And it's good news. It's not evil. It's not bad. It's not hurtful. It is good news. And it is for your good and for your freedom and for your flourishing and thriving and for your good and your delight.